The year 1903 marked a pivotal moment in photography when the Kodak Brownie camera made capturing memories accessible to ordinary travelers. But sometimes those memories reveal more than we bargained for. My name is David Sterling, and for the past 15 years I've specialized in digital restoration of historical photographs, breathing new life into images that time forgot. I've enhanced family portraits from the Civil War era, restored daguerreotypes of forgotten pioneers, and uncovered hidden details in century-old landscapes that tell stories their original photographers never intended to share. But nothing in my extensive career prepared me for what I discovered last month when a peculiar photograph landed on my desk. It arrived in a worn manila envelope with no return address, accompanied only by a handwritten note that read, "Found this in my grandmother's attic. Thought you might find it interesting." The photograph itself appeared unremarkable at first glance. A sepia-toned image of a steam locomotive stopped at what looked like a rural station platform. Dated July 15, 1903, in faded pencil on the reverse side. The locomotive was a typical example of early 20th century engineering, its brass fittings gleaming despite the age of the photograph. Smoke billowed from its stack into a cloudless sky, frozen forever in that single moment over a century ago. Passengers in period dress stood on the wooden platform, their faces serious and composed in the way people posed for photographs during that era when exposure times were lengthy and smiles were considered inappropriate for formal documentation. What drew me to examine this particular image more closely wasn't the train itself or the formally dressed passengers, but something subtle in the composition that nagged at my professional instincts. After decades of working with historical photographs, you develop an eye for anomalies, for details that don't quite fit the expected narrative of their time period. There was something about the way the light fell across the train cars, something in the shadows that seemed deliberately placed rather than naturally occurring. Using high-resolution scanning equipment, I began the meticulous process of digital enhancement. The original photograph measured roughly 4 by 6 inches, printed on the heavy paper stock common to early 20th century amateur photography. As I increased the resolution and adjusted the contrast, details that had been obscured by time and fading gradually emerged from the sepia tones, like ghosts materializing from morning fog. The locomotive's number became clearly visible, painted in ornate Victorian numerals on the side of the engine. The platform revealed its weathered wooden planks, each board distinct and scarred by years of passenger traffic. The faces of the waiting travelers sharpened into individual personalities, their clothing speaking to their social status and the fashion sensibilities of 1903 America. A woman in an elaborate feathered hat clutched a small leather valise. A gentleman in a dark suit consulted a pocket watch suspended from a gold chain. Children peered around their parents' legs with the wide-eyed curiosity that transcends any historical period. But as I continued to enhance the image, focusing on different sections and adjusting various parameters to reveal hidden details, I noticed something that made me pause. The train consisted of 5 passenger cars, each with multiple windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Most of the windows showed only darkness within, the interior of the cars lost to shadow and the limitations of early photographic technology. However, one window in the third car from the engine appeared different from the others. At first, I attributed the anomaly to a trick of light or perhaps a flaw in the original photographic plate. Early cameras were notorious for producing unexpected artifacts, double exposures, and chemical irregularities that could create false impressions in the final print. But as I applied more sophisticated enhancement techniques, isolating that particular window and increasing the contrast while carefully adjusting the brightness levels, something began to emerge that challenged everything I understood about this innocent travel photograph. There, pressed against the glass of that third car window, was what appeared to be a human face. Not the blurred suggestion of a passenger glimpsed through reflection and shadow, but a distinct visage with clearly defined features staring directly out at the photographer. The face belonged to someone who shouldn't have been there, Someone whose presence in that window defied both photographic convention and, as I would later discover, historical possibility. The features were sharp and well-defined, suggesting this wasn't merely a photographic artifact, or the result of pattern recognition making us see faces where none existed. The eyes were particularly striking, dark and intense, seeming to look directly through the lens at whoever was capturing this moment in 1903. The expression was neither friendly nor hostile, but rather watchful, as if the person behind that face was studying the photographer with the same intensity that I was now studying them more than a century later. What made this discovery even more intriguing was the positioning of the face within the window frame. Rather than being centered as you might expect from a passenger casually looking out during a station stop, the face was pressed close to the glass in the upper right corner of the window, positioned in such a way that it would have been difficult for the original photographer to notice without careful examination of the developed print. I spent hours that first day manipulating the digital enhancement, trying different techniques to either confirm or debunk what I was seeing. I applied noise reduction algorithms to eliminate potential grain patterns that might be creating false positives. I used edge detection software to identify legitimate structural elements versus photographic artifacts. I even consulted with colleagues who specialized in forensic photography analysis, asking them to examine the image without revealing what I suspected I had found. Their independent analyses confirmed my initial assessment. There was indeed a human face visible in that train window, and it had been captured as part of the original 1903 photograph, rather than being added later through any form of manipulation or double exposure. The facial features showed the same grain structure, tonal qualities, and aging characteristics as the rest of the photograph, indicating they were part of the same original exposure. But this confirmation only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Who's this person whose face appeared in that window? Why were they positioned in such an unusual manner against the glass? And most puzzling of all, why had no one noticed them before, given that this photograph had presumably been in someone's family collection for over a century? I began researching the historical context of the photograph, using the locomotive number and architectural details of the station to identify the specific location and railway line. The train was part of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway system, and the station appeared to be a small rural stop somewhere in the upper Midwest, possibly Wisconsin or Minnesota, based on the landscape visible in the background. Railway records from 1903 indicated that this particular locomotive, engine number 847, ran a regular passenger route between Chicago and Minneapolis, making numerous stops at small towns along the way. The timing suggested this photograph was taken during the height of summer, travel season when families would journey to lakeside resorts or visit relatives in distant communities. Passenger manifests from July 1903 revealed typical travelers of the era, families with children, business travelers, and the occasional mysterious individual listed simply as private party with no further identification. Without knowing the exact station where this photograph was taken, it was impossible to narrow down which specific passengers might have been aboard the train that day. But as I delved deeper into the railway's history, I discovered something that added another layer of intrigue to the mystery. Engine 847 had been involved in a significant incident just 3 weeks after this photograph was taken. On August 7, 1903, the locomotive had derailed approximately 40 miles outside of Minneapolis when the engineer claimed he saw someone standing on the tracks who vanished just before impact. The subsequent investigation found no evidence of anyone being struck, and the engineer's account was dismissed as the result of heat exhaustion and long hours. The derailment had resulted in several passenger injuries and the total destruction of 3 train cars, including the third car where I had discovered the mysterious face in the window. All passengers and crew had survived the accident, but the incident had marked the end of Engine 847's service life. The locomotive was scrapped within months of the derailment, its parts sold to other railway companies or melted down for raw materials. This historical context transformed what had begun as a curious photographic anomaly into something far more compelling. The face in the window belonged to someone who had been aboard a train that would meet disaster just 3 weeks later. Had this person survived the derailment? Were they among the injured passengers whose names appeared in newspaper accounts of the incident? Or had they disembarked at some earlier stop, never knowing how close they had come to tragedy? I returned to the photograph with renewed intensity, applying every digital enhancement technique at my disposal to extract additional details from that haunting face in the window. The more I studied those features, the more convinced I became that this wasn't simply a random passenger caught in an unusual moment. There was something deliberate about the positioning, something that suggested this person had wanted to be seen, had pressed their face against that window, knowing it would be captured in the photograph. The eyes were the most compelling feature, dark and penetrating even through the limitations of century-old photography. They seemed to hold secrets, to know something about the fate that awaited this train and its passengers in the weeks to come. But that was impossible, wasn't it? How could someone in 1903 have known about an accident that wouldn't occur for another 3 weeks? As I prepared to dig deeper into this mystery, I realized I was about to embark on an investigation that would challenge not only my understanding of historical photography, but perhaps my understanding of history itself. I decided to contact the sender of the photograph, hoping to learn more about its origins and perhaps gain access to other family documents that might shed light on this mysterious passenger. The return address on the envelope led me to Margaret Whitmore, an elderly woman living in a modest Victorian home in Duluth, Minnesota. When I called to explain my findings, her reaction was immediate and unsettling. "You found someone in the window?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. My grandmother always said there was something wrong with that picture, but none of us ever knew what she meant. She kept it hidden in a drawer for decades, claimed it gave her nightmares. Margaret agreed to meet with me the following week, promising to bring along any other materials from her grandmother's collection that might be relevant to my investigation. The drive to Duluth took me through the same rural landscape that would have surrounded the railway line in 1903. Rolling farmland stretched to the horizon, broken by small towns that seemed frozen in time. As I traveled those back roads, I couldn't help but imagine that locomotive making its way through this same countryside over a century ago, carrying its complement of unsuspecting passengers toward their appointment with disaster. Margaret's home sat on a tree-lined street in one of Duluth's older neighborhoods, its wraparound porch and gabled roof typical of late 19th century architecture. She greeted me at the door, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Her living room was filled with family photographs spanning several generations, creating a visual timeline of American life from the Civil War era to the present day. My grandmother was Elizabeth Hartwell, Margaret explained as she poured tea from an antique service set. She was traveling alone on that train in 1903, heading to visit relatives in Minneapolis. She was only 19 at the time, and it was her first long journey away from home. Margaret retrieved a wooden box from a side table and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of letters, postcards, and documents yellowed with age. Among these family treasures was Elizabeth's travel diary from 1903, its leather binding cracked but still intact. The pages were filled with a young woman's careful handwriting, documenting her excitement about the journey and her observations of fellow passengers. But as I read through the entries, I found something that made my pulse quicken. July 15, 1903, the same date penciled on the back of the photograph. Elizabeth had written, "Stopped at Millerville Station for water and coal." A photographer was taking pictures of the train. I noticed something strange about one of the passengers in car 3. A man was pressed against the window in a most unusual manner, staring out with such intensity that it made me uncomfortable. When I mentioned it to the conductor, he looked puzzled and said car 3 was nearly empty, with only an elderly couple and their grandson aboard. But I know what I saw. The entry continued with Elizabeth's description of the mysterious passenger. He had dark hair and the most penetrating eyes I've ever seen. His face was gaunt, almost hollow, and there was something about his expression that filled me with dread. He never moved from that position against the window, even as other passengers walked about the platform during our stop. It was as if he was trying to communicate something urgent, but I couldn't understand what. Margaret watched as I read, her own expression growing troubled. "Grandmother wrote about that man several more times during her trip," she said quietly. She became convinced he was following her, though she never saw him again after that station stop. She said she would catch glimpses of that same face in windows and mirrors for years afterward, always watching, always trying to tell her something. I asked Margaret if her grandmother had ever mentioned the train derailment that occurred 3 weeks later. The elderly woman's face went pale as she nodded slowly. "That's what made it so terrible," she whispered. Grandmother had planned to return home on that same train, engine 847, but she fell ill in Minneapolis and had to delay her departure by several days. When she heard about the accident, she was convinced the man in the window had been trying to warn her somehow. The diary contained another entry from August 8, 1903, the day after the derailment. Elizabeth had written, "The newspapers are calling it a miracle that no one was killed in yesterday's accident. But I keep thinking about that strange man I saw at Millerville Station. Was he trying to warn me? Did he somehow know what was going to happen? I've been having nightmares about those eyes, and I can't shake the feeling that I was meant to be on that train when it crashed." Margaret retrieved another item from the wooden box, a newspaper clipping from the Minneapolis Tribune dated August 8, 1903. The headline read, "Northwestern Railway Train Derails Outside City, Dozens Injured." The article described how engineer Thomas McKinnon had claimed to see a figure standing on the tracks just before the accident, though no evidence of such a person was ever found. The engineer's description of the person he saw matches grandmother's description of the man in the window. Margaret said, pointing to a paragraph in the yellowed newsprint, "Dark hair, gaunt features, and eyes that seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent." The railway company dismissed McKinnon's account, said he was suffering from heat exhaustion and overwork. I photographed all of Elizabeth's diary entries and the newspaper clipping, adding them to my growing file on this increasingly complex mystery. But as I prepared to leave Margaret's house, she stopped me with one final revelation that would change the entire direction of my investigation. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grandmother wasn't the only one who saw that man. Over the years, she corresponded with other passengers who had been on the train that day. 3 other people mentioned seeing the same figure in various windows during the journey. They all described him the same way, and they all had the strangest feeling that he was trying to warn them about something terrible that was about to happen." Margaret handed me a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are the letters grandmother exchanged with those other passengers. They formed a sort of informal group, trying to understand what they had experienced. But one by one, they stopped writing. The last letter is dated 1925, and it mentions something that might interest you. The writer claims to have found another photograph from that same day, one that shows the mysterious man much more clearly." My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon and examined the letters. The final correspondence was from a man named Robert Ashford, postmarked from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His spidery handwriting conveyed both excitement and fear as he described his discovery. "I found it in my father's effects after his funeral," Ashford had written. "A photograph he never showed anyone, hidden away in his private papers. The man from the train is clearly visible, but not in a window this time. He's standing on the platform right next to the photographer, close enough to touch. But here's the strangest part, Elizabeth. According to the railway records I've researched, there was no passenger by that name or description on the train that day. It's as if he was never there at all, yet somehow he appears in multiple photographs taken by different people. The letter ended with Ashford's promise to send Elizabeth a copy of this second photograph, but there was no indication that such a transfer ever took place. Margaret confirmed that her grandmother had never received any additional images, and attempts to locate Robert Ashford's descendants in Cedar Rapids had proven fruitless. As I drove back through the Minnesota countryside, my mind raced with possibilities. Who was this mysterious figure who appeared in multiple photographs that seemed to have no official record of being on the train? How could he have been trying to warn passengers about an accident that wouldn't occur for 3 weeks? And most importantly, where was this second photograph that Robert Ashford had discovered? The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the man was a railway employee who wasn't listed on passenger manifests. Maybe he was a local resident who had boarded briefly at one of the small stations along the route. But even as I considered these possibilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dealing with something far more extraordinary than a simple case of mistaken identity or incomplete records. That evening, I returned to my laboratory and began a more intensive analysis of the original photograph. Using spectral imaging techniques, I examined the window where the face appeared, looking for any signs of photographic manipulation or double exposure that might have been invisible to earlier examination methods. What I discovered only deepened the mystery further. The spectral analysis revealed that the face in the window had been captured using light wavelengths that shouldn't have been possible with 1903 photographic technology. The features showed a luminosity that suggested they were somehow generating their own light source, rather than simply reflecting the ambient sunlight that illuminated the rest of the scene. This was scientifically impossible for a conventional photograph of that era, yet the evidence was undeniable. I began reaching out to other historical photography experts, sharing my findings while carefully avoiding any mention of the supernatural implications. Dr. Patricia Hawkins at the Smithsonian Institution examined my digital scans and confirmed the spectral anomalies. Professor James Chun at MAIT's Photographic Analysis Laboratory ran his own tests and came to the same conclusion. Whatever had been captured in that train window in 1903, it didn't follow the normal rules of light and shadow that governed early 20th century photography. As word of my discovery spread through the academic community, I began receiving emails and phone calls from researchers who had encountered similar anomalies in historical photographs. A curator at the Library of Congress mentioned a daguerreotype from 1847 that showed an unexplained figure in the background of a crowded street scene. A private collector in San Francisco described a Civil War-era photograph that contained what appeared to be a soldier who didn't match any known uniform or equipment of the period. But it was a call from Dr. Sarah Morrison, a professor of American history at the University of Chicago, that provided the breakthrough I had been seeking. Dr. Morrison specialized in railway history and had been researching the Chicago and Northwestern Line for a book about 19th century transportation. When I described my photograph and the mysterious passenger, her reaction was immediate and startling. "I know exactly who you're talking about," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I've been tracking reports of this figure for over a decade. Railway employees called him the Watcher, and there are documented sightings going back to 1887. He always appeared shortly before major accidents or disasters, always trying to warn people who seemed destined to be involved." Dr. Morrison's revelation transformed my investigation from a curious, photographic anomaly into something far more significant. She arranged to meet me at her office the following week, promising to share her extensive research files on what she had dubbed the Railway Phantom. The drive to Chicago gave me time to process the implications of what she had told me. If this mysterious figure had been appearing at railway disasters for decades, then the 1903 photograph wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern. The University of Chicago's history department occupied a Gothic Revival building that seemed frozen in time, its stone corridors echoing with the footsteps of countless scholars who had walked these halls before me. Dr. Morrison's office was a testament to decades of meticulous research, with filing cabinets lining every wall and stacks of documents covering most available surfaces. She was a woman in her early 60s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and wire-rimmed glasses that reflected her computer screen as she worked. "I've been waiting years for someone to bring me photographic evidence," she said as she cleared a space on her desk for my materials. "Most of the accounts I've collected are eyewitness testimonies, diary entries, and newspaper reports. But actual visual documentation has been extremely rare." She opened a thick folder labeled Anomalous Railway Incidents, 1887 to 1920, and began spreading out photocopied documents and newspaper clippings. The earliest account dated back to October 15, 1887, when a freight train derailment near Springfield, Illinois, had been preceded by reports of a strange man seen walking along the tracks just hours before the accident. A section foreman named Patrick O'Malley had described encountering an individual who seemed to appear from nowhere, warning him about loose rails ahead. When O'Malley returned with a repair crew, they found a section of track that had indeed shifted due to recent heavy rains, preventing what could have been a catastrophic passenger train derailment. Similar incidents followed a consistent pattern. The mysterious figure would appear days or sometimes weeks before a railway disaster, always attempting to communicate warnings to railway employees or passengers. Sometimes his warnings were heeded, averting tragedy. More often, they were dismissed as the ramblings of a vagrant, or dismissed entirely when the person claiming to have seen him couldn't be located for questioning. Dr. Morrison showed me a particularly compelling account from 1895, when a passenger named Helen Grayson had encountered the figure while waiting at a station platform in Ohio. "He approached me with the most urgent expression," Grayson had written in a letter to the railway company. "Though he spoke no words, his gestures clearly indicated I should not board the evening train to Cleveland. Something in his manner was so compelling that I changed my plans and took a later departure. The evening train I was meant to catch derailed 30 miles outside the city when a bridge collapsed." What made these accounts especially intriguing was the consistency of physical descriptions across multiple decades and geographical locations. Every witness described the same gaunt features, the same penetrating dark eyes, and the same desperate urgency in his attempts to communicate. The descriptions never varied, suggesting either an elaborate hoax maintained across multiple states and decades, or something far more extraordinary. The railway companies tried to suppress these reports. Dr. Morrison explained as she arranged the documents chronologically. Bad for business to have passengers afraid of phantom warnings. But railway employees kept talking among themselves, passing down stories from one generation to the next. By 1900, most experienced engineers and conductors knew about the Watcher, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. She pulled out a railway employee handbook from 1898 that included an unofficial addendum written in the margins by various workers over the years. The handwritten notes described procedures for reporting unusual sightings and included crude sketches of the mysterious figure. One sketch, drawn by a conductor named William Hayes in 1901, bore a striking resemblance to the face I had discovered in the 1903 photograph. The pattern of appearances seemed to follow the expansion of the railway system itself. As new lines were built and passenger service expanded into previously remote areas, reports of the Watcher followed. Dr. Morrison had mapped every documented sighting, creating a visual timeline that showed his appearances spreading westward with the advancing railroad network. "What's particularly interesting," she noted, pointing to her map, "is that his appearances become more frequent and more desperate in the years leading up to 1903. It's as if he knew something catastrophic was approaching, something that would make his warnings more urgent than ever before." I shared Elizabeth Hartwell's diary entries and the newspaper accounts of the Engine 847 derailment, watching Dr. Morrison's expression grow increasingly animated as she absorbed the new information. She cross-referenced the incident with her existing files and discovered that the 1903 derailment had been preceded by an unprecedented number of watcher sightings along the Chicago and Northwestern line. "Look at this," she said, pulling out a folder marked Summer 1903 Incidents. Between June and August of that year, there had been 17 separate reports of the mysterious figure appearing at various stations along the route. Railway employees had filed formal complaints about a vagrant who seemed to materialize without warning, always trying to interfere with normal operations by gesturing frantically at trains or attempting to block passengers from boarding. The reports painted a picture of escalating desperation. The watcher's behavior had become increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to the derailment, as if he knew his time was running out. Station masters from 5 different towns had described the same individual appearing multiple times, sometimes within hours of each other, despite the impossibility of traveling such distances without using the railway system himself. Most compelling was a report filed by the station master at Millerville, the same location where Elizabeth Hartwell's photograph had been taken. On July 14th, just one day before the photograph was captured, he had written to his supervisors about a disturbed individual who has been haunting the platform for the past week, attempting to prevent passengers from boarding westbound trains. Despite repeated attempts to remove him from railway property, he continues to appear at will, showing a supernatural ability to evade our security measures. The station master's description included details that matched both Elizabeth's diary entries and the face I had enhanced in the photograph. He noted the man's hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire, along with his silent but urgent gestures that conveyed a sense of impending doom. The report concluded with a request for additional security personnel, noting that this individual's presence has begun to unnerve both passengers and staff. Dr. Morrison then revealed the most startling piece of information in her collection. Hidden among the railway company's archived correspondence was a letter dated August 10, 1903, just 3 days after the Engine 847 derailment. It was addressed to the president of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway from a source identified only as a concerned observer. The letter, written in elegant penmanship that seemed oddly formal even for the era, read, "The warnings have been ignored and the price has been paid in twisted metal and human suffering. The guardian who walked your rails for 16 years has completed his vigil. The debt of conscience that bound him to this earthly realm has been satisfied through the preservation of those meant to survive. He will trouble your operations no more." The letter was unsigned, but included specific details about the derailment that hadn't been released to the public at the time it was written. The writer knew about the engineer's claim of seeing a figure on the tracks, about the exact number of injured passengers, and about the specific cars that had been destroyed in the accident. Most remarkably, the letter accurately predicted that no similar incidents would occur on the Chicago and Northwestern line for the remainder of the year. "Railway records confirm that prediction," Dr. Morrison said, checking her files. After decades of regular accidents and mechanical failures, the Chicago and Northwestern experienced its safest period in company history from August 1903 through the end of that year. It was as if whatever had been causing the previous incidents had simply vanished. She showed me company safety reports that documented the sudden improvement in operational efficiency. Mechanical failures dropped to almost zero. Signal malfunctions ceased entirely. Even minor incidents like livestock on the tracks became virtually non-existent. The improvement was so dramatic that railway executives attributed it to new safety procedures, though no such procedures had actually been implemented. But here's what really convinced me that we're dealing with something beyond normal explanation. Dr. Morrison continued, pulling out her final folder. "I've spent years trying to identify this mysterious figure through historical records. Census data, immigration documents, military service records, hospital admissions, even prison records. I've searched every database available for someone matching his physical description, who might have had a connection to the railway system." She spread out dozens of documents showing her exhaustive research efforts. Birth certificates, death certificates, employment records, and passenger manifests spanning multiple decades. Despite the consistency of witness descriptions and the specific details provided by numerous observers, no official record existed of anyone matching the Watcher's description ever living, working, or traveling in the areas where he appeared. It's as if he never existed in any official capacity, she explained. Yet dozens of credible witnesses saw him, spoke with him, and in some cases were saved by his warnings. The photographic evidence you've discovered is the first tangible proof that he was real, that he actually existed in some form. We spent hours examining the enhanced image alongside Dr. Morrison's collected testimonies, looking for details that might provide clues to the Watcher's identity or origins. The face in the train window seemed to hold secrets that transcended the limitations of early 20th century photography, yet those secrets remained tantalizingly beyond our reach. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Morrison shared her theory about what we might be witnessing. I believe the Watcher was someone who died in an early railway accident, someone whose death could have been prevented if proper warnings had been given. His spirit became bound to the railway system, compelled to prevent others from suffering the same fate he had experienced. She pointed to the chronological pattern of his appearances, noting how they seemed to intensify during periods of rapid railway expansion when safety standards lagged behind technological advancement. The 1880s and 1890s were particularly dangerous times for railway travel. New lines were being built quickly with minimal safety oversight. Accidents were common, and many could have been prevented with better communication and warning systems. Her theory suggested that the Watcher's mission had been to serve as that early warning system, using whatever supernatural abilities he possessed to alert people to impending disasters. His increasing desperation in 1903 might have reflected his awareness that his time was ending, that some cosmic debt was about to be paid. The fact that he disappeared after the Engine 847 derailment supports this interpretation, Dr. Morrison concluded. Perhaps that incident represented the completion of his earthly mission. He had spent 16 years trying to prevent railway tragedies, and finally succeeded in saving the lives of those who were meant to survive. But questions remained. If the Watcher had been bound to prevent railway accidents, why hadn't he been able to stop the 1903 derailment entirely? Why had his warnings been limited to cryptic gestures and desperate facial expressions, rather than clear verbal communication? And most puzzling of all, how had he managed to appear in photographs while apparently having no physical presence that could be documented through normal means? As I prepared to leave Dr. Morrison's office, she made one final revelation that would reshape my understanding of the entire investigation. "There's something else you should know," she said, retrieving a small wooden box from her desk drawer. "Last month, I received this in the mail from an anonymous sender. No return address, no explanation. Just this box and a note saying that I would know what to do with it when the time came." Inside the box was a daguerreotype, the earliest form of photography, dating from approximately 1855. The image showed a railway construction crew working on laying tracks in what appeared to be a remote wilderness area. In the background, barely visible among the trees, stood a solitary figure watching the workers. Even in the primitive photographic quality of the daguerreotype, the figure's gaunt features and intense eyes were unmistakable. "I believe this shows the Watcher as he was in life," Dr. Morrison said softly. "A railway worker who died during the construction of one of the early lines, probably in an accident that could have been prevented with proper safety precautions. His spirit became bound to the railway system at the moment of his death, beginning a decades-long mission to warn others of similar dangers." The daguerreotype provided the missing piece of the puzzle, showing the Watcher not as a supernatural entity, but as a man who had once lived and worked alongside the crews, building America's expanding railway network. His transformation from living person to spectral guardian made sense within the context of the dangerous working conditions and frequent fatal accidents that characterized railway construction in the mid-19th century. As I examined the daguerreotype more closely, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. In the lower right corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows, was what appeared to be a partially buried grave marker. The inscription was too faded to read clearly, but the positioning suggested it marked the final resting place of someone who had died during the construction project. "I believe that grave belongs to our watcher," Dr. Morrison said, following my gaze. "And I think the anonymous sender of this daguerreotype wanted us to find it. The location appears to be somewhere along the original Chicago and Northwestern route, possibly in one of the more remote sections that were built during the 1850s. She had already begun researching the historical records of railway construction deaths from that period, cross-referencing company reports with local newspaper accounts of fatal accidents. The work was painstaking, as many construction deaths had gone unreported or had been documented only in company files that were later destroyed or lost. But her preliminary research had identified several promising leads. In 1854, a construction worker named Thomas Whitmore had died in a dynamite accident while clearing rocks for a new section of track in northern Wisconsin. His body had been buried near the work site due to the remote location and difficulty of transporting remains to the nearest town. Company records indicated that Whitmore had been known for his safety consciousness and had repeatedly warned supervisors about dangerous working conditions in the weeks before his death. The physical description of Thomas Whitmore in the company employment records matched the witness accounts of the watcher remarkably well. He was described as tall and lean with dark hair and penetrating eyes. Co-workers remembered him as intensely serious about safety procedures, often clashing with supervisors who prioritized speed over caution in their rush to complete the railway line. More significantly, Whitmore had died on October 12, 1854, just 3 days before the first documented sighting of the watcher on October 15, 1887, exactly 33 years later. The mathematical precision of this timing suggested that some cosmic force had determined when his spiritual mission would begin and how long it would continue. "If my theory is correct," Dr. Morrison concluded, "Thomas Whitmore spent 33 years as the watcher, trying to prevent others from dying in the same preventable accidents that had claimed his own life. His appearances intensified as railway travel became more common and the potential for mass casualties increased. The 1903 derailment represented the culmination of his mission, allowing him to finally rest." As I left Chicago with copies of Dr. Morrison's research files and the mysterious daguerreotype, I realized that my investigation had evolved far beyond a simple case of photographic enhancement. I was now dealing with a story that spanned 5 decades and touched on fundamental questions about life, death, and the possibility of redemption beyond the grave. The drive back to my laboratory gave me time to process everything I had learned. The rational part of my mind still struggled to accept the supernatural implications of the evidence, but the consistency of witness accounts across multiple decades and the photographic proof I had uncovered made it increasingly difficult to dismiss as elaborate hoax or mass hallucination. That evening, I began organizing all the materials into a comprehensive case file. Elizabeth Hartwell's diary entries, the newspaper accounts of the engine 847 derailment, Dr. Morrison's collected testimonies, and the mysterious daguerreotype showing the watcher in life. Together, they painted a picture of a man whose death had been transformed into a decades-long mission of protection and warning. But one crucial piece of the puzzle remained missing. If Thomas Whitmore had indeed been buried near the construction site where he died, then his grave should still exist somewhere along the original Chicago and Northwestern route. Finding that grave site might provide the final confirmation needed to prove that the railway phantom had been a real person whose spirit had become bound to the railway system he had helped build. The search for Thomas Whitmore's burial site would require extensive fieldwork in some of the most remote areas of northern Wisconsin, following railway lines that had been abandoned for decades. But as I studied the topographical maps and historical surveys that might guide such an expedition, I knew that this investigation had become more than just an academic exercise. It had become a quest to solve one of the most compelling mysteries in American railway history. The following week, I assembled a small expedition team consisting of myself, a local historian familiar with Wisconsin's railway heritage, and a ground-penetrating radar specialist who could help locate unmarked graves along abandoned railway corridors. Our destination was a stretch of the original Chicago and Northwestern line that had been decommissioned in the 1960s, now overgrown with decades of forest reclamation. Using historical surveys and construction maps from the 1850s, we identified 3 potential locations where Thomas Whitmore's grave might be found. The first site was near what had once been a major rock-cutting operation, where dynamite had been used extensively to clear a path through the granite outcroppings that characterized this region. According to company records, this was where the fatal accident had occurred in October 1854. The terrain proved more challenging than anticipated. What had once been cleared railway corridors were now dense with maple and birch trees, their roots intertwining around the remnants of steel rails that had been deemed too expensive to remove when the line was abandoned. We navigated by compass and GPS, following the subtle depression in the landscape that marked where trains had once thundered through this wilderness. Our ground-penetrating radar operator, a methodical man named Carl Peterson, who had spent decades locating unmarked graves for historical societies, began scanning the area systematically. The radar could penetrate several feet into the soil, revealing subsurface anomalies that might indicate human burial sites. Within hours of beginning our search, the equipment detected a rectangular disturbance approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, positioned about 50 yards from where the original track bed would have run. The anomaly was located in a small clearing that offered a clear view of the railway corridor, exactly the type of location where a work crew might have chosen to bury one of their fallen colleagues. More significantly, the radar indicated that something metallic had been buried alongside whatever organic material remained, possibly the tools or personal effects that would have been interred with a construction worker in that era. We began excavating carefully, using archaeological techniques to preserve any artifacts we might discover. The soil layers told the story of 170 years of natural accumulation, with distinct strata marking different periods of forest growth and decay. At a depth of approximately 4 feet, our shovel struck something solid and unmistakably artificial. What emerged from the earth was a simple wooden marker, preserved by the acidic soil conditions that characterize this region. The wood was darkly stained and partially rotted, but carved letters were still visible across its surface. Though weathered and difficult to read, the inscription clearly spelled out Thomas Whitmore along with the date, October 12, 1854, and the words "killed in service of progress." Below the wooden marker, we found the remains of what had once been a simple pine coffin, its boards collapsed inward but still forming a recognizable rectangular outline. Within this space lay the skeletal remains of a tall, lean individual, along with several metal objects that had survived the decades of burial. A pocket watch, its brass case green with patination but still intact. A set of surveyor's tools wrapped in oiled leather. And most remarkably, a small leather-bound notebook whose pages had been preserved by the waterproof wrapping. The notebook contained entries written in a careful hand, documenting Thomas Whitmore's concerns about safety conditions during the railway construction project. Entry after entry revealed a man obsessed with preventing accidents, constantly noting hazardous practices and inadequate precautions that put workers at risk. His final entry, dated October 11, 1854, just 1 day before his death, read, "Warned Morrison again about unstable rock face above the cutting. Dynamite charges not properly calculated for granite density. Someone will die if corrections not made. Management refuses to listen." As we carefully extracted these artifacts from their earthly resting place, I felt a profound sense of completion. Here was the physical proof that Thomas Whitmore had existed, that his concerns about railway safety had been documented in his own hand, and that his death had indeed resulted from the very type of preventable accident he had been trying to avoid. The pocket watch had stopped at 2:47, presumably marking the exact moment of the dynamite explosion that claimed his life. When I opened the case, I found a small daguerreotype portrait inside, showing a man whose gaunt features and intense eyes matched perfectly with every description of the railway watcher that had been recorded over the following decades. But perhaps the most compelling discovery was a letter tucked inside the notebook, written in Whitmore's hand, but apparently never sent. Addressed to his sister in Chicago, it revealed the depth of his frustration with the dangerous working conditions and his growing premonition that tragedy was inevitable. "I fear my warnings fall on deaf ears," he had written. "These men are so focused on completing the line ahead of schedule that they ignore basic precautions. If something happens to me, know that I tried to prevent it." As I carefully placed Thomas Whitmore's artifacts back in their resting place and restored the earth above his grave, I understood that some mysteries are meant to be solved not for academic glory, but to honor those who tried to protect others even beyond death. The face in that 1903 train window wasn't just a photographic anomaly. It was the final appearance of a guardian who had spent 49 years trying to save lives along the rails he helped build. Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries remind us that even in death, some souls refuse to abandon their duty to the living.